Ileana is a research fellow with the Decolonising Arts Institute and associate lecturer at the University of the Arts London. Previously based in the Department of Anthropology at University College London, where she is now honorary research fellow, she participates in the European Research Council funded project Citizens of Photography, the Camera and the Political Imagination. Ileana was the Linda Wyatt Gruber 66 Curatorial Fellow in Photography at the Davies Museum at Wellesley College, where she curated the exhibition Charlotte Brooks at Look, 1951 to 71, and she received her PhD in art history from the Institute of Fine Arts, New York University. As an associate lecturer, she taught in the photography and imaging department at Tisch School of Arts and in the art history department at NYU, at the Parsons School of Design in New York, and in the Fine Arts Department at West University, Timișoara, Romania. Michael is an art historian, art critic, and curator based in London. He is reader of art history and theory of art at Chelsea College of Arts at UAL, and founding member of the Research Centre for Transnational Art, Identity and Nation. Over the last 20 years, Michael has written extensively on themes involving modern and contemporary art, with a particular emphasis on Brazilian culture. He has curated a number of solo exhibitions by Brazilian artists, while collaborating with institutions such as Tate Modern, the Henry Moore Foundation, Camden Arts Centre, the Whitechapel Gallery, the Barbican, Ibero-Camargo Foundation, Galeria Nara Rossler, amongst others. He also ran an annual Brazilian art exhibition programme for the Ferrers Trust in Nicosia, Cyprus. Ileana and Michael's conversation will be unmoderated and in 3 parts with short breaks in between. We'll then have some time for Q&A, so do please post any questions or comments to the chat box during the conversation, and they'll try to pick these up at the end. Over to you then, Ileana and Michael.
Okay.
Thank you, Susan.
Thank you. Thank you
for the invitation.
Thank you, Michael, for agreeing to participate in this in-conversation event. So like Susan explained, we've structured the talk as a conversation around 3 kind of key themes or threads, issues that we're very preoccupied about, involved with. And so the conversation will, in theory, we've each responded with a set of kind of images and thoughts to these threads, to these provocations. But in theory, this would be a more of a dialogic kind of structure. So we'll see how it plays out. It's a bit more difficult to do this online than in person, but I think it might just work. So bear with us. And just for the sake of kind of making everything fluid and flow, we would ask you to please kindly hold on to your questions until the Q&A. There will be plenty of room and time for discussion. We're very curious to hear your input and to hear your thoughts. So yeah, without further ado, I'm going to pass the mic to Michael and to start.
Thank you, Ileana. I would like to speak about this image, which is a photograph of a work by Cil de Meirelles, Southern Cross, of 69 to 1970, which we used for the publicity for this conversation. But I think it kind of serves as a very good introduction to all 3 threads that we're going to kind of discuss. I'd like to read a little bit from the catalogue information, which was an exhibition that took place at MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, which included Cil de Meirelles. The catalogue's from 1970 as well, so it's the same year as the work. The work consists of 1 centimeter cube, comprised of 2 types of wood, oak and pine, if I'm not mistaken, which are used to create fire. So it's a kind of tiny object with a huge potential. So I'll read just a few lines from from the exhibition catalogue where Silda Meirelles makes a statement. So, I am here in this exhibition to defend neither a career nor a nationality. I would rather speak about a region which does not appear on official maps, a region called the Southern Cross. Its original inhabitants never divided it. Others came, however, who for some reason did. Such a division remains to this day. I believe every region to have its own boundary lines, imaginary or not. The line I'm referring to is called Tordesillas. So these kind of initial lines kind of really summarize and kind of indicate how we could consider this particular work as a kind of a proto-decolonial artwork, in the sense that Sildo is kind of invoking the Tordesillas line, which was a line that decreed by Pope Alexander VI following Columbus' discovery of the Americas. Portugal being the principal kind of maritime nation, together with Spain at the time, was very indignated and scared that Spain would just take over the whole continent. So the Pope decreed this Tordesillas line, so that everything that was to the west would be, that's still undiscovered, would be rightfully Spanish, and everything to the east would be rightfully Portuguese. So in a sense, the Tordesillas line, and Sildo mentions this himself in 1970, in the lines I've just described, is it kind of divides us to this day. I mean, Ileana, for example, is speaking about Central America, Spanish-speaking artist, and I'm speaking about the Brazilian context, Portuguese-speaking artist. So we are still kind of divided by that line. Also, going into the next, to the first thread of this conversation, the fact that Silda Meirelles was included in an exhibition at an institution such as MoMA in 1970 is interesting as a kind of a moment in which Latin American artists begin to kind of insert themselves within the kind of canonical or the mainstream circuits of art, which brings us to the first thread. Perhaps Ileana might want to start with
Yeah, so we thought about, again, dividing our discussion into these key themes and threads. So I just want to, to start us off. So Michael will actually be talking. Our sequence here, it's not chronological. I'm sorry, the chat is extremely distracting, so I'm just a bit, I hope everything is okay and everyone can follow. We're actually starting at the end of this period that we've put here between parentheses 1940s and 1990s, but Michael will return to an earlier episode, so to say. But I would like to talk about an episode in the history of Central American art that is very significant and very, very interesting for many different reasons. So a character that is very well known to practitioners, to curators, scholars of Central American art, Virginia Perez Raton. She was an incredible dynamic force, kind of pushing for the affirmation of Central American artists in a global setting. And I want to start by talking about this exhibition. There's really not enough time to go into depth here. But so in 1996, an exhibition was organized at the newly founded Museum of Art, Contemporary Art and Design in San Jose, Costa Rica, titled Mesótica II, Centroamérica Regeneración. So Mesótica II, Central America Regeneration. So, just hearing a lot of noise. So this exhibition was planned as a response or as a reaction to a rather famous exhibition that was organized by in 1994 by Gerardo Mosquera, Rachel Weisz, and Carolina Ponce de Leon, Ante America, which had actually traveled to the Museum of Contemporary Art and Design. This was a very new institution. It was very important for Costa Rica, very important for Central America, also in a moment where we have to think that the Guatemalan peace accords were only signed in 1996. So this is a very kind of significant moment when this is all taking place. So Ante America comes to San Jose, and yet there is no Central American artist, not even one, represented in the exhibition. So in response to Ante America, Virginia Perez, together with Rolando Castellón, curate this exhibition, Mesótica II, with a number of 20 Central American artists. So they do a lot of research. And the idea is that for the first time, really, the takes shape this notion of there being something like Central American art. Now, it's also really important to note that within this kind of constellation of Central American art, which starts being refined, this notion that starts being refined around the 1990s, there's kind of a lot of, in terms of the perception from the outside, there's a lot of incongruities and there's a lot of sort of confused spaces. And there is this kind of very dominant impression particularly from, at that point, the center periphery debate was very much present in conversations. So seen from the outside, Central America still has this kind of dusty, isolated, kind of backward vision, perhaps even more so because of the armed conflicts and the civil wars that were happening at the time. But again, I think for us it's really important to ask, well, but that kind of backwardness and that isolation for whom, right? It's kind of the question that endures in many ways to date. So I think that in addition to this, so I just kind of wanted to pinpoint this moment where there's a concerted effort from within Central America, but specifically grounded in Costa Rica and through people like Virginia Perez and Rolando Castellón, who are trying to create a kind of to create an image, not an image, to create a notion of Central American art that will coexist or that will live together within a kind of broader, more general areal of art. So, and that can enter and participate in international events such as biennials and international exhibitions and so on and so forth. Of course, the frustration also is not just by relation to the world and not just by relation to the center, it's also by the relation to the rest of Latin America and the kind of perceived neglect of the region within Latin American scholarship and practice itself. Anyhow, I just want to briefly make kind of a stop to talk. Again, it's just all a bit rushed to talk about a very important figure, Rolando Castellón, who was the co-curator of Mesótica and who's one of the main curators behind this big project of the Museum of Contemporary Art and Design in San Jose. And I also bring up this example of this museum. For a long time it managed to move a lot of things in Central America, and it managed to kind of put people together, to connect people and to create certain networks that were very fraught or maybe even non-existent before. This is not to deny kind of the initiative that artists had in parallel on the side or in addition to this initiative, but I think that for that moment it was just very important to create an institution that could represent artists and the interests of artists locally, transnationally, transregionally, but also globally, yeah? And if we're looking at the situation today, the museum is right now at risk of being closed, of being incorporated into the other art museum in San Jose. There's a severe cut of funding, which leads me kind of into the question. I'm just showing you here an image of an exhibition that was actually in 2005, curated by Tamara Diaz Bringas, of a retrospective of Rolando Castellón, who in and of, I mean, his oeuvre, aside from his curatorial initiative, is absolutely fascinating, astounding, and frankly, in my opinion, very little known outside of Central America. And this is just for you to see a view of the exhibition, of the retrospective exhibition in 2005. I should mention that Rolando was actually one of the first Chicano and Latin American curators at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. So he's a very, very important transnational figure as well. But to kind of skip to where I want to get to before too long, I want to say that, I'm talking about the creation of an institution that was made with the purpose of supporting and encouraging the production of contemporary art in Central America, at national level in different countries, but also at this transnational again, and then at a broader level. But what I also want to say is that Central America has a very deep kind of history, and I'm talking about Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, even Panama. There's a very strong, deep history of what we would call in Spanish autogestión, so self-management, and this is very, very important. Self-organizing, self-management. Artists run projects, and I just want to point to one example. This is more recent, a museum that was founded in 2012, again in the absence of a contemporary art museum in Guatemala. Jessica Caire and Stefan Bencham founded this museum in a rented space. It's a little shop that actually sells eggs, or used to sell eggs. And what they do is they invite artists to kind of populate the space with their artworks. They're in situ, kind of site-specific installations. What I'm showing you here is an installation that I managed to see in 2016, I think, and it's work by Regina José Gaindo, who's very recognized outside of Guatemala as well, meanwhile, but even then. And I just find it very beautiful how the photographs of her performance pieces are kind of integrated into the city landscape through this projection onto the glass. So I'll pass it on to Michael, but I'd
just like to, didn't this little shop museum travel somewhere, which I find amazing?
Yeah. So this was part of it was included in an exhibition at LACMA in Los Angeles, and it traveled. They did this long trip from a replica of it, traveled from Guatemala to LA, and it was a I think there was a crowdfunding project, part of the project. Anyhow, I have to say that I don't necessarily find. Anyhow, we could get into more conversation around this in the discussion, but I'm not necessarily like a huge fan of that kind of movement. I think that the point of contact and exchange doesn't necessitate the physical movement of this this object type museum into the United States. It feels a bit expropriative to me, but at the same time, it's a funny gesture, and I guess it's a very Dada kind of like gesture, and we can just embrace it as that. But anyhow, Michael, I'll pass it on to you.
Okay. Could you move this, change the slide, please? Thank you. I mean, speaking across the Tordesillas line, it's very tempting to look at the different stages of development of each kind of region. It's a temptation that I would warn against, because it's very problematic thinking about this idea of progress, of developing nations being at different stages of development. So I as this kind of a cautionary note, I kind of reference these two images from around the same time, both of Brasilia, the new capital, the kind of the main kind of outcome of the Brazilian 1950s developmentalist project. So on the left-hand side, René Buri's picture of a family visiting Brasilia on the day of its inauguration, and on the right-hand side, Marcel Gauthiero's image of the construction workers' quarters, probably where such a family would live in the outskirts of the modern kind of utopian city. So development and progress comes at a cost, and doesn't necessarily deny the question of inequality, which is another kind of issue that will re-emerge throughout our conversations, I think. Okay, so moving on, I mean, the foundations of the institutions in Brazil are very much a consequence of that moment of developmentalism. So if we could move to the next slide, please. Okay, so here we have the construction work for the two museums and the São Paulo biennial kind of building site. The two museums buildings, the MASPI in Sao Paulo, which was built in the 1960s by the architect Ileana L, and the Museum Modernart in Rio on the right, which was by Alfonso Higi. We kind of we're kind of tempted to think of Brazil as this kind of ultra-modern nation, etc. But if we think, if we compare to the UK, for example, the foundation of the ICA, which was kind of from the 1940s as well, and it took a long time to have its own kind of permanent location, is a kind of a contemporaneous kind of event. The difference in Brazil with the institutions, I guess, if we're talking, if we're comparing to the UK, for example, is that if we move to the next slide, please, is that in Brazil the foundation of the institutions of art, the museums of modern art, etc., the São Paulo Biennial, were followed very much the North American model, the Museum Modern Art specifically. Here in this image we have Francisco Matarazzo, or Chichilo as he was better known for, signing an agreement with Nelson Rockefeller, and the kind of the posture of the two kind of really indicates the kind of the power relations going on here. So Brazil, the Museum Modern Art in São Paulo, for example, which Chichilo Matarazzo founded, the first exhibition that they held was called From Figuration to Abstraction, which is a very kind of MoMA-like exhibition title, but which nevertheless has very little connection to the development of modernism in Brazil. Modernism in Brazil never quite developed into abstraction. It was always about representing the Brazilian identity, its people, etc. So there was a kind of a disjunction between the institutional models, imported institutional models, and the reality of artists on the ground, and this led to a huge protest by artists and intellectuals, architects even, at the occasion of the first São Paulo Biennial in 1951, yes. Mainly accusing the institution of importing bourgeois notions of art and neglecting the reality of artists in Brazil. So this is an issue that we will come back in the next session. So I'll return to this, and I think we will have a short break now.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing, which is that, so in Central America, you know, there's a need, there's a very clear need for institutions affirmed during this period in the 90s when Virginia Perez kind of begins her project, again, in collaboration with many other people. And what I find super relevant is that, again, we're looking at a context where self-organizing is key. Artists are initiating projects, they're initiating networks, they're kind of, they're doing a lot on their own. But we're here now in 2020 in a situation where one of the biggest, kind of most important initiatives in Central American art is crumbling at the base, the Museum of Contemporary Design. And a lot of artists I know will agree that there is a need for institutions. So I guess kind of the challenge is, how do you negotiate the need for institutions? Because you can create all the change you want from below, but if you don't have institutions and infrastructure, specifically infrastructure and monetary infrastructure to support those efforts, it's just very, very difficult. Like, I really don't want to create this notion that somehow precarity, to romanticize precarity. Rather, I actually want to emphasize that there's an incredible amount of hardship, which is also rooted in a history of extractivism that kind of continues to plague Central America and Latin America as a whole. And you know, it endures and obviously has a deep impact on cultural institutions and any kind of cultural endeavors, including art. So I guess I just wanted to bring that back into what I was trying to say earlier.
In Brazil, institutions at the moment are suffering as well. There's a huge attack from kind of politically motivated sackings and replacements of directors, etc. One of the few museums that is actually managing to have a very powerful program is MASP in São Paulo, which arises from the kind of relationship between its director, Adriana Pedrosa, and the historian Lilian Schwartz. So that kind of collaboration has led into amazing exhibitions looking at indigenous women's art, Afro-Atlantic connections between Brazil and Africa and the slave trade, etc. So there are finally in the last years some really great experiments, but also unfortunately lots of institutions are kind of in serious crisis.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, so in the interest of time, we initially had planned a 5-minute comfort break just to kind of clear the air and but we'll do a shorter break if that's okay with everyone. So let's return, I would suggest, in 3 minutes. Does that sound good, Michael? So we'll be back here at 14:37 on the dot. Thanks, everyone.
Okay. Hello, welcome back. We're moving into the next thread. Can Latin American arts be contemporary within mainstream art historical discourse? So it's a kind of continuing my comments in the last section, in the last thread, in which the North American model of modernism, in which figuration moves into abstraction, develops into abstraction, which is very much kind of looking back at how abstract expressionism took place, is kind of transferred into the so-called transition between modern and contemporary art. Could we have the next slide, please? So you read, I mean, going back to Sildo Meirelles, when you read about conceptual art in most books, probably in the first page, you will come across a reference to abstract expressionism, meaning that conceptual art reacted against abstract expressionism, was a kind of a rejection of that very kind of surface-based, etc. The medium referring to itself, etc. And there are kind of three reactions really within this type of discourse. The first being conceptual art or minimalism, the second and the third pop, and all three kind of appear around the same time, somewhere in the mid-60s probably. Thinkers and art theoreticians have looked at this as a kind of anachronism in which Duchamp appears to be more contemporary than Pollock, for example, even though the Duchamp's fountain, for example, dates from 1917 and Pollock's work from the 1940s. So this kind of is used as a basis for a kind of inherent anachronism within contemporary art. I think the idea of anachronism is very interesting. However, it's problematic when applied to this very kind of specific idea of progression between modern and contemporary art. It becomes particularly problematic when applied to work from Latin America and other places as well, because the development of modernism, as I mentioned before, doesn't necessarily reflect the way in which modernism developed within the kind of canonical North American, European models. I would even question that myself, but anyway. Could we have the next slide, please? Okay. So we have, for example, trying to exemplify the problem in looking at this kind of transition between the modern and contemporary as a kind of definition. We have an exhibition, it's actually the same curator, Kynaston McShine, the same curator that would later curate Information, which is that exhibition in which Silda participated. In 66, I think, 66 or 67, I can't remember probably. He curated a show called Primary Structures, which Hal Foster, for example, describes as the kind of emergence of minimalism, and Foster, for example, defines minimalism as a kind of inaugural moment within art. I included the second image on the right, which was a kind of an exhibition curated in 2014 by Jens Hoffman, in which he proposes to look at artists that could have been included in primary structures at the time but weren't. So, for example, Eloy Tisika, here's an image of a spatial relief by Eloy Tisika, included in that exhibition, kind of along the waves of these kind of restaging exhibitions and performances, etc. Now, the problem with inserting artists such as Tisika within the context of a kind of mainstream, kind of so-called inaugural minimalist exhibition is that it denies the entire kind of genealogy from which artists such as Tisika emerged from. Again, it imposes a model which is not that of the artist, him or herself. Could we move on to the next slide? So, although it might look similar to minimalism, the work from which, the context from which Elio emerged relates very much to the neo-concrete movement in Rio de Janeiro, which itself refers to neoplasticism and Russian constructivism. So very different genealogies from that transition between abstract expressionism and minimalism and conceptual art, etc. So in a sense, by looking at contemporary artists from outside the northern Western hemisphere, using those same models, those kind of canonical models, art historical kind of structures in which to include them, in a sense denies their very contemporaneous, their very specific, locally specific contemporaneity. They kind of exile these artists from their own context, and it's in that sense that we question the possibility of Latin American art to be contemporary in the sense that we understand the contemporary in the mainstream. I think that's my last image. I'll pass it to you, Ileana.
I guess for me, it's interesting to contemplate this notion of contemporaneity from the perspective of Central American art, which again is always perceived as having a bit of a lag behind kind of everything else. And to think about a notion of multiple contemporaries kind of moving alongside. And I want to kind of engage with this question, particularly from the perspective of contemporary indigenous art. And actually right now there's a whole conference, I think, organized by Tate. And I think that one of the main, it's Tate and MoMA in Mexico. And one of the main things they're investigating is, this very notion of contemporary indigenous art. I'm very interested. There's been a significant kind of number of indigenous artists from Central America, and particularly from Guatemala, who have been recently included into rather prominent exhibitions and collections in the West, But of course, I mean, this kind of conversation around indigenous contemporary art and its belonging and its stance by relation to the global contemporary is something that is definitely not a phenomenon of the present. I mean, this is something that's kind of come in waves, that we've seen conversations along the same lines happening in the past. But I guess by relation specifically to Central America, I'm interested in this inclusion of indigenous artists in a context where the very kind of the very notion of indigeneity and citizenship is still in dispute within that same kind of Central American within the national context of Central America. In Guatemala, given the majority of the population being indigenous, it's a very prominent issue. There's continuous kind of demands for self-determination, for autonomy, that are, the state has a very problematic position by relation to indigenous rights. But also, we could speak about Costa Rica, a country that does not understand itself as indigenous or Black, yet it has a Caribbean, Afro-Caribbean identity very much as a part of its constitution as a nation. And likewise, indigenous Costa Rica, there's an indigenous presence in Costa Rica that's significant and a history that's very important. So there's all sorts of contestations about what, the status of indigenous citizens within countries like Guatemala. And I think that is very important to kind of contemplate as a kind of a very local yet issue that yet has like major repercussions, because again, the contemporaneity of citizens, Guatemalan citizens in this case of indigenous descent, remains questioned. And there's a historic problem here that has to do with this denial of contemporaneity, right? The perception of indigenous people as kind of existing outside of time, being extra temporal, living in a kind of perpetual beyond, which is fundamentally a political problem, this asynchronicity with the present. So I want to show as an example, kind of thinking along those lines, of an artwork, very recent artwork by Guatemalan artist Benvenuto Chavajay Ixtetela, who is Mayan Tzutujil. And Benvenuto's work, he works quite a lot with performance, and this piece was made around the anniversary of a decree in the late 19th century under the presidency of Justo Rufino Barrios. And on the left, you have the piece comes with a fragment from with the decree itself. So there was a decree that indigenous citizens would become so-called Ladinos. So Guatemala invented a separate category to assimilate Indios, to assimilate indigenous citizens within the construction of a liberal nation state. And in addition to kind of making indigenous citizens, kind of denominating them as Ladinos and having them accept this forced identity, there was also an imposition of Western clothing. So what's happening in the picture on the left, you see Benvenuto kind of taking on this attire, bleaching his hair, and basically embodying this persona of the Ladino, which again is a completely it's a fictional category that was imposed on indigenous peoples of Guatemala to kind of assimilate them within the construction of a so-called modern nation state. So this denial of coexistence, this synchronicity of indigenous peoples, I think comes in very forcefully if we're having conversations about contemporary indigenous art. And I want to show one more instance. So this is a photograph I took in the studio of also Maya Tzutujil artist Antonio Pichilla, and you can see several of his artworks. Antonio works with textiles extensively and also with painting. He combines the two, and his practice is rooted in traditional Maya, but specifically Tzutujil aesthetics, geometric design, to geometric textile design. And so I think that so here we see an instance where abstraction is not just an aesthetic form in the sense that, you know, it is understood under kind of the label of art, modern or contemporary, but rather is also a mode of being, of seeing, of living, yeah, which fits into a greater cosmovision, so a worldview, yeah. And I think that work, like Antonio's, very forcefully makes an argument, you know, that there is no contradiction here with contemporary art. His practice is very much contemporary art, rooted in this locality, rooted in this history, rooted in this tradition. Yet nonetheless, when it's being incorporated into kind of the global contemporary, when it's incorporated into collections and into exhibitions, there's a loosening of the ties that this work has within its locality, which creates, I think, a lot of kind of philosophical and conceptual problems in terms of how this work is then perceived, and actually quite inadequately, which I would argue also kind of is in many ways can be extremely counterproductive due to the continuous kind of under representation of indigenous artists within their own nations, but even transnationally within Latin America, but you know, around the world, there's a lived condition of underrepresentation. There's a continuous kind of political struggle that is ongoing. So I think it's just very important to, while you know we might celebrate the success of these artists internationally, I think it's also very important to not divorce this work from its immediate kind of context. And I think that that's very often a little bit what happens, or maybe not a little bit. Yeah, so I think I want to end there for now. And Michael, I don't know, what should we do? Should we take another quick break? Or
I mean, you're going to continue. So if you're on a run,
no,
if you need a break,
yeah, let's.
I'm okay to carry on, but it depends on you.
Okay. All right, then how about we just skip the next break, and because this really ties in, I think, quite nicely with our next thread, which is kind of this thinking about global art history as it stands, where it's at now, and decolonizing, the notion of decolonizing, and why, you know, we pose it as a need to decolonize global art history. Michael.
Sorry, I was
muted. Yeah.
I mean, what you were saying about Pichian, it's very much relevant to the way in which Brazilian people of indigenous heritage, artists of indigenous heritage, are seen, and they're beginning to kind of be more present within the local art circuit, but still very much under kind of certain prejudices in terms of their expectation that they should refer to kind of traditions, etc., and rather than being participating in their own right within the contemporary art circuits, etc. So this idea of questioning such kind of categorizations and such imposed models, I guess, will inform on this next section of ours, this next thread, whereby I mean, we've been talking about criticizing imported models which are imposed upon the region, but also this doesn't mean that the actual regional or national art histories shouldn't be questioned themselves. And I think this is where we're moving in within this thread. I think you wanted to discuss. Are you going to jump that first image? No. you had another.
Um,
You were talking about an artist that is from the
yeah,
Caribbean.
no, but I wanted to start with this.
Okay.
It's the next one. I guess I just forgot. I thought the next upcoming image was yours. Yeah, I mean, let's see. Um, Actually, do you mind if we did take the 2 minutes? Because I think I need
Okay,
just a little mental break. Okay,
that's
so
fine.
I would just suggest just 2 minutes, just to like take a breath. I'll just get a bit of water, and then we start again. Is
Yeah,
that okay?
I
I hope that's okay.
maybe I should mention that you haven't been well, and
No, it's
that
okay. It's okay. It's fine. So we'll come back. Okay. Just give us 2 minutes.
okay.
Okay, so I think we can return. Thanks for, thanks for waiting. Okay, yeah, so this whole notion, okay, let's think about it. Decolonizing global, the idea of global art history. I thought of an image, sort of a piece that is very important to me, to kind of thinking. So this piece was very recently put on view at Tate. Tate acquired it after it was included in the 2006 Venice Biennial. The piece is made by Nicaraguan artist Ernesto Salmerón. It's a kind of a multi-level piece, and I don't have kind of the time to go into all the intricacies. We could actually literally spend the whole hour talking about this piece. It's very symbolic, I think, for that moment of the late 90s, what I was talking about earlier, Virginia Perez, Rolando Castellón, kind of summoning artists from all over Central America, building from below a kind of a presence that is then kind of transferred internationally. We do make contemporary art. We don't just make art about bananas and parrots and exotic plants. This is actually something that is a statement that is affirmed again and again in the literature and the kind of the testimonies from that moment, that the expectation, of course, was that that is the kind of work that Costa Rica, Central America would deliver to the world, right? So this piece by Salmerón was made in the aftermath of the Contra War. And basically, just break it down a little bit. So he, during the Sandinista revolution, the icon of the Sandinista revolution was General Augusto Sandino. And there were graffitied images of him kind of scribbled all over cities and towns that kind of were a rallying call to support this underground movement that then kind of delivered the Sandinista revolution, that kind of the popular insurrection that then, you know, during the 1980s transformed the country in the aftermath of the Somoza dictatorship. During the 1980s, it was also when the counter-revolutionary war began, which was a very violent conflict in Central America. So Ernesto's piece revolves around these different levels of history. It's a bit of an excavation of that history, literally, because what he did was he removed a section of a wall with the figure of Sandino as a graffiti. It's inside that truck, under that green tarp, and he removed it from the wall with great effort and a lot of help, put it on the truck, and then the truck, there were different elements again in the piece. The piece was exhibited locally. It created a massive controversy. And then it was moved on this truck from Managua all the way. It was brought to Venice by two drivers who had been combatants in the Contra War on the opposite side. So one was a revolutionary and the other was a counter-revolutionary, to kind of break the story down. Now, I picked this piece because I think that in speaking about global art history, it literally kind of embodies notions of mobility, interconnection, exchange, transnationalism, while being deeply grounded in local history. So basically, you cannot understand this piece if you don't understand this history, this deep history, which, as the artist himself says, is impossible to understand anyhow. This is a very Salmeron-like statement that he would say, oh, well, Nicaragua, I've been trying to understand Nicaraguan history my whole life, but it's a project that fails from the start because you cannot understand Nicaraguan history anyhow. But my point here is to say that, again, that we're looking at an object that embodies this kind of to the global contemporary. It's currently in the collection at Tate. It uproots a very kind of local, an object that is very much rooted in its local history. And I wonder, and I question the extent to which that movement carries with it the weight of that history, and what are the implications in case it doesn't. And I will just tell you that when this piece was exhibited, I think it was in 2018 first, and it was on view for a while. Nicaragua was going through these incredibly powerful and very violently repressed protests. Hundreds of people lost their lives. There were a lot of people who were imprisoned. There were a lot of people who were injured. And there's currently a population of about 60,000 to 80,000 people that have had to go into exile, right? So this was happening at the moment that this piece went on view at Tate. Nonetheless, the text on the wall that was exhibited next to the piece made absolutely no notion of that. So again, to me, that was like a big kind of missing kind of piece, yeah. But at the same time, because this piece mobilizes a huge kind of political history, yet that seems to be missing from even from the historiographic. It is not missing from the historiographic record, but it's missing from the museological record. So I think that that's really, really powerful. And something very important to think about. And on that note about kind of locality and deep rootedness in history, I guess I'm the kind of researcher, writer that's obsessed with detail and deep thinking. And I think that you have to commit basically to your subject and to commit through a dialogic kind of process, and you have to commit long term. So not being from Central America, I've kind of spent a significant amount of time kind of diving into these histories and these stories, and I'm finding more, the deeper I go, I'm finding the less, I know it's just kind of the classic story. But I guess within this global contemporary art history project, there is this filling in the blanks, expanding the canon by filling in the blanks, practice and effort. Yet nonetheless, this invitation for these artists to kind of coexist comes from within a preset model or matrix. And there's an implicit hierarchy that cannot really be turned on its head from the outside. So that kind of prevents a level of long-term commitment that artists and practitioners working in an area like Central America can bring. So I wanted to kind of also bring in as a further example an artist from Nicaragua as well, but this time from the Nicaraguan Caribbean, June Beer. She was Afro-Nicaraguan painter that has an incredibly interesting biography. Nicaragua has these deep kind of breaks within the country between the Afro indigenous and Afro descendant population, the indigenous population, and then the so-called Nicaragua mestiza, which to many, many have written about kind of this was to a certain extent being a myth created by a modern affirmation of the nation. But anyhow, I just want to say that so June Beer is an example of an artist that is from Nicaragua. She is Nicaraguan, but first and foremost, she is a Caribbean artist, and you have to understand Nicaragua, you have to understand Central America, you have to understand Caribbean colonial history to understand that distinction. So I guess for me, the question here, is how these hierarchies that are being created within the global contemporary art are problematic, and how they can be decolonized. Yeah, I think that is something that needs to be incorporated as a part of an active kind of process of disputing the continuous kind of remaking of this so-called global canon.
You mentioned something in that respect before when we were discussing organizing this, that her work cannot be sold to international museums and so on. I found that quite striking.
Yeah, so the Nicaraguan state kind of put a ban on it, passed her work into patrimony, so you cannot sell June Beer works, which I do wonder also about, when we're looking at this global contemporary, I wonder about the extent to which the canon is built through acquisition, which is obviously extractivist. I mean, there's no question about it, especially if we're looking at powerful institutions in the West, kind of buying the best of. I mean, I've seen this happen in Eastern Europe and my kind of region of origin as well, not just in Central America. And so I do wonder, in the case of Jumbier, of course you could organize exhibitions easily. You can loan these works, but in the absence of the possibility of an acquisition, I do wonder again how this canon of so-called global contemporary is shaped and reshaped. Yeah, so I think there's also a very important kind of market aspect, but that also has to do with colonial extractivist mentalities and the kind of the very constitution of the museum project in the West. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
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 Are you have another image? I'm not sure if.
Yeah, I'm going to skip this image, and
okay.
if you want to.
I think that is quite well with. I mean, the case of acquisitions by international museums is something that affects Brazil very much. I mean, most of the some of it, a lot of very important work has been saved. For example, the Tate Modern or Tate acquiring several works by Oiticica saved them from the fire that burnt most of his work. That belonged to the estate, for example, and the series of museum fires in Brazil through just lack of funding and general political neglect has affected or has kind of destroyed. It's kind of, you can't even imagine how much important collections and archives have disappeared, including archives of native languages and so on. So there is a kind of a double aspect to this, but at the same time, a lot of this the key works of art historical significance have gone abroad, which effectively denies a nation of writing its own history. Or yeah, so I wanted to come back in time a little and talk about these two works, which relate to the kind of Afro-Brazilian presence in Brazil from the late 19th century to the kind of early 20th century. On the left, Modesto Broco's The Redemption of Ham, of 1898, so 10 years after the abolition of slavery. And this picture kind of depicts quite precisely the official policy of whitening, or branqueamento, which was a strategy of how, after the abolition of slavery, how could one, very racist, with eugenics kind of influences, how could one better, so to speak, the population? And the solution was to import poor European workers, mainly Italian, to the nation, so that they would miscegenate with the former slaves, Brazilians. There's a description of thinking for the white granddaughter or son, following this kind of policy of miscegenation. So this is a kind of European influence eugenics on that still has very much a presence within the mentality, particularly of the Brazilian elite. The second picture on the right is by a very wealthy artist, Tarsila do Amaral. She was a heiress of kind of coffee producers, and she spent most of the 1920s in Paris, mingling with avant-garde artists. She was a student of Fernand Léger. She studied with several Cubist artists, etc. And this painting, entitled A Negra, or the Negress, is from 1923, when she was still studying with Fernand Léger, and it reflects the this kind of avant-garde idea in Paris at the time, of purism. That is to say, to kind of purify the legacies of Cubism from its expressionist, i.e. Germanic contamination. So we have two notions of purifying, so to speak, within these two pictures. And could we pass could we go to the next one? I'm going to try to close with this image, which I think is a kind of contemporary reflection on both those inherited kind of legacies, the legacy of branqueamento, of whitening, and also this idea of this almost commodification of primitivism, which the Brazilian modernist elites were engaged in the 1920s. Well, this is performance artist and painter Antonio Ba, and performing what he called Transfiguration, the disappearance of a recipe for a saint, where he, with this, what do you call a ralador, grater, this kind of cheese grater or something, he grates an image of a saint, which is made of gesso. I'm forgetting the English term now. This white powder. So he grates the saint until it's reduced to powder, and the movement, or the physical activity of grating it until it's disappeared, covers his body in sweat, and when he throws the dust over, he kind of transforms into white. So it's kind of a reflection on this kind of enduring legacy of whitening, in which the Afro-Brazilian religion has to this day been repressed, particularly with the rise of the neo-Pentecostal evangelicals, and kind of which see these traditions as being something to be attacked and denied. So when we look at the kind of this huge gap, temporal gap between the 19th century and the 21st century, we still find vestiges of very, well, we still find a very racist society, and that is reflected on the way in which particular critical, and I would say decolonial artworks are still viewed. I mean, Antonio Ba had to flee Brazil because his works were attacked in an exhibition in Porto Alegre for being anti-Catholic or anti-Christian, etc. And he was attacked by these kind of right-wing fanatics and threatened with death, etc. So there is a lot to be done in terms of looking at those racial, ethnic, class divisions still present within Brazil. And I think I'll stop it here because we're running out of time and we want to allow for questions. So we'll move on to questions straight away, no?
Yeah, sorry, the presentation just did something really odd.
Yeah.
Can you see the Sildo picture right now? Can you see the Sildo picture?
Yeah, I can.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah. So in the interest of we're running short. We want to invite questions from you, and hopefully we'll be able to respond.
Okay. I thought we might have some questions in the chat box.
I see Paula wants to ask a question. Paula, do you want to go ahead?
Okay. I have unmuted my microphone.
Yeah,
Hello,
it works.
everybody.
Hi.
Hello,
Hello, Paula.
everyone. Hi, Ileana. Hi, Michael. It's lovely to hear something about Latin America somehow in the day. Yeah, I mean, I think Michael has mentioned these issues of, I mean, I think it's very good, your comparison of Central America against Latin America, and particularly Brazil, in terms of development of the arts and the principles and concepts against the political and cultural background. And I think that Michael presented the points of, you know, of ruptures there and how this structure of modern art, you know, has started in the 50s, isn't it? And I think there's a point there, if you're talking about neocolonialism and or decolonization, very important point in terms of politics, which was the American relationship, the USA Economic Development Program in relation to Brazil, that was fundamental. They have the Bank for International Reconstruction Development, which was a cooperation between Brazil and the USA, began with Vargas and in the 40s, but really was afterwards that has progressed. And without the support and money that came into Brazil, both for industrialization and to support the collections and the Biennale as well, that hasn't been mentioned, but that is a very important point. I think perhaps there, well, obviously the size of Brazil and the importance of the country in terms of after war, you know, the political blocs, you know, in support America and Brazil. This exchange there, I think, is very important. And I think the point that New York has become the main cultural center rather than Paris, and disconnections, you know, we need to think that Mary Martins, for instance, and her husband, Carlos Martins, who was the diplomat and ambassador for Brazil in America, were very important on the exchange at that time. So anyway, it's just to say, yes, it's to hear, and that's just to complement with a phrase, with a talk by Lisa Papp. Let me see if I can find it, because my thesis is just, my PhD thesis is just about it. Somehow, Resinify Modernity, Clarke-Seeking Categories of the Modern in Brazil.
I think Paula's been cut.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, no.
You have a problem. You're muted, Paula.
Lisa Papp, in an interview to me, said, I mean, the museums weren't just important for the exhibitions that they were pushing on, but they were center for meeting up, developing new ideas. And Ligia was saying, like, before the building was ready for the Modern Art Museum in Rio, it was at the MAC building, and that there was the canteen, for instance. She said at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, we were all there, and there was cinema, it was film, there was music. So it's a series of art, like crossing fields of art, languages, you know. So I think that's a point that we can't forget, that there was these very strong connections between Brazil and America at that point, which actually might have favored these developments there, you know. So I don't know how that worked, and that's my question to Ileana. In Central America, how is this post-war connection between Central America and the USA?
Oh gosh, I mean, it's surprisingly little known that the Cold War begins in Guatemala with the coup against the democratic government of Jacopo Arbenz, who, there was a CIA-supported coup that inaugurated decades of civil war and armed conflict in that country. And so the relationship with the United States is extremely fraught and very difficult. Furthermore, economically, I mean, it's a completely extractivist from the 19th century. It's an extractivist relationship that continues actually to this day, from Dole, previously United Fruit, and the continuation of banana, exotic fruit kind of business, to culture, to mining, and to cultural policy. And I think that I mean, I guess a parallel with Brazil would be that in almost all of the Central American countries there was a project to create national art institutions that in many ways were modeled on European and US institutions. But I do think that, you know, it's a very different context than the rest of Latin America, in the sense of the kind of the economic power and the investment that is being made in the cultural field. And the most interesting work really happens on the side, and it happens through artist-initiated projects, galleries, people, you know, increasingly kind of traveling and working in an international, transnational kind of setting. So I think that in Central America, that's really where the strength and the beauty of the so-called, you know, if you want to call it avant-garde project into contemporary art, lies within these very, very strong kind of networks between people and the institutions that they create, rather than within a greater kind of institutional framework.
I have a question from the chat from Madeline Turner, which I'll just read, I think. Thank you both. I'm so interested to know more about June Beer, Afro-Nicaraguan arts, and their representation or reception, even if limited within Central America. Building on that, how do you think the limited representation of certain artists within their own region can be reconciled with the extractivist practices you mentioned of acquisition abroad?
Yeah, I mean, it's an incredibly powerful question. And you know, I mean, I don't know, at least the countries in Latin America that I am familiar with, you know, continue to deal with the legacy of colonialism. And it's a legacy that needs to be undone. And it impacts primarily indigenous and Afro-descendant people. And so someone like June Beer, I mean, is an incredibly important artist, a Nicaraguan artist, and she has received the recognition that perhaps other artists coming from the Caribbean have not. And these are areas that continue to be economically extremely at risk. And so even you know, the making, art making within those conditions is a kind of it's a very different type of project. So, but I guess what I would say was that, I mean, obviously a lot more research is needed, and you know, there are local kind of interests, initiatives along those lines, but I think that transnational interest is extremely welcome, especially if we're looking at the Nicaraguan Caribbean. It needs to be seen in conversation with the entire, I mean, the entire coast, Caribbean coast of Nicaragua, Honduras, and Guatemala needs to be looked at transregionally in itself and by relation to the English-speaking Caribbean, for example. And so I just feel like there's an enormous amount of research that still needs to be done. And then in terms of, you know, museums like MoMA or Tate purchasing the work of artists, I mean, ideally there would be some form of exchange, right? It wouldn't just be like, oh, we're just amplifying our collections here. And, you know, but what happens locally, I think that it's very hard to make an argument that recognition from outside leads to kind of development of less racist kind of cultural practices internally. I don't think that it works that way. But anyhow.
Well, what I think that what is happening, like over there, as Michael said, the difficulties. I mean, artists are still donating their works to create collections for the modern, for the Museum of Rio, for instance, that's recently created. Most of the works were donated by their own artists. They weren't acquired. So
yeah. I think I'll ask, there's a question that relates to that, Paula. So I'll from Esquivel, I think. So he's saying that I mentioned institutions in Brazil following the North American model in the 40s, 50s. And what do I think is the tendency with public and private institutions today? And if I could elaborate how I see this today and so on. So it's very complicated. There is I think it was in 2018. I mean, time is going by very quickly, but there was a massive fire in the National Museum in Rio, which absolutely destroyed the entire collection. And that was, I mean, the politicians blamed the university. The museum was public in the sense that it was administered via a public museum, but administered through a public university. But public universities themselves are in crisis, and it was obvious that such an important museum. It used to be the residence of the emperor in the early 19th century. It was the royal household. It was the kind of like Buckingham Palace of Brazil. So it was historic just in that sense, let alone it's one of the most important collections of archaeological, ethnographic, etc. In Latin America. So that just shows the amount of public negligence that there is within museums and institutions that are administered or funded publicly. Most of the museums and foundations that operate have some kind of private or foundation status. Now, so I'm not sure how we're doing for time, but I'll try to be brief. Some institutions, such as the Pinacoteca do Estado de São Paulo, have, and MASP, for example, have very solid financial stability and are able to collaborate with institutions such as Tate and MoMA and Reina Sofia, etc. So I would consider those as a kind of world-class museums, to use a kind of a term that I don't like very much. But others are in complete states of destitution with no funding. So it's a very kind of mixed bag. I guess we can look at the situation in the UK after 10 years of austerity, and we'll find a kind of similar inequalities and differences. I'm not sure I answer your question, but I think we need to move on because we're running out of time.
We are actually, sorry to interrupt, we are actually out of time, but I wonder if you would both like to try to respond to the last question in the chat from Sarah Hardy.
Yeah, I was just looking at, it's really great question again, and thank you all for the great questions. Sarah says, given the various problems and tensions you mentioned, divorcing, expropriating artists from the context and genealogies, how can we support South and Central American student artists and designers attending and making in the context of UAL best today? How would you suggest? I think this is a conversation that would be incredible to have within UAL, and I would love to participate in it. But I think that is the key, that now, at least since the 2000s, but even more so from the 2010s, there's been a lot more artists and designers kind of moving and studying across Latin America and also in many other parts of the world. And I think that this creates a kind of enables the possibility of different models of exchange outside of these kind of top-down hierarchical structures. And I think that is really where the future lies, for lack of a better. It's actually something that makes me incredibly motivated and interested in kind of what might happen. Because again, there's this background of autogestión, people knowing well how to organize, how to build things from scratch, this DIY-ness. But then, of course, like learning from kind of a more international setting, which is something that I'm hoping UAL can provide, and then kind of bringing that back or involving it in future conversations. So anyhow, I think it's a longer discussion that's very crucial and important to have, and to put these students in dialogue with students coming from the many other parts of the world that they come from, rather than through a Western, just like to keep kind of pushing a Western perspective.
Yeah, I think that if the university is serious towards decolonizing the curriculum, the university, etc., the arts, it should engage in offering scholarships for people from places such as Latin and South America, Africa, etc., either through waiving course fees, but hopefully through supporting students from these areas, brilliant students that would kind of come through competitions, etc., through bursaries, etc. But also, I think from the other side, I think that collectors who have been supporting exhibitions and such events, collectors of Latin American art, for example, they should also have the responsibility to support scholarships and residencies, etc., as part of their engagement with the art of the region. So it's a kind of, I mean, we've seen the government has slowly, but definitely moved away from supporting and offering funding for international students. I mean, when I was a student, it was possible to have funding if you came from outside the UK and the EU. Today, I think even the EU, they're only through the funding bodies such as the EHRC, they only get their fees waived. They don't get bursaries even. So the kind of the funding bag has got smaller and smaller. And I think decolonizing, the idea of decolonizing the curriculum and within a university also involves kind of lobbying for a change in that kind of tendency.
I agree.
Yeah.
We should maybe come back to this question in a meeting if we can at some point. If you are up for that.
Definitely.
Yeah, great. As creative producers, a bit more. So maybe
finding it hard to hear. The sound is very bad.
So yes, I think we possibly have a few too many mics on, but I'm afraid we are out of time. We have gone over by a few minutes. I would like to invite everyone to mess with their connections by turning their cameras on and waving. A huge thanks to Ileana and Michael for a fantastically rich conversation. Thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you for all the fantastic questions too. A reminder that the event has been recorded, so we'll be circulating this link to everyone as soon as we can. Thanks again. Thank you to Ileana and Michael especially.